I'm Ellen Sukiel, Professor of Philosophy and Provost of Stevenson College. We are two units of many that are supporting this lecture by Jonathan Moreno today. I'm very pleased to welcome my old friend, Jonathan Moreno. Jonathan is professor, has 3 titles. He's Professor of Medical Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School. He's the David and Lynn Silfen University Professor at the University of Pennsylvania and Professor of the History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He's one of our country's most distinguished bioethicists and bioethical policy advisors, and he's got lots of good stories to tell about Washington if you can catch him alone. Jonathan served on important national commissions and presidential advisory committees. Particularly relevant in the context of this talk is his service as a senior staff member of President Clinton's Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments. He's given invited testimony for both houses of Congress, and he's a frequent guest on news and information programs. His recent book, Undue Risk: Secret State Experiments on Humans, was hailed by critics for its very disconcerting revelations about state-sponsored human experimentation with clinical and biological agents, and was judged to be a book which will shape debate for years to come about past and future human experimentation. He's going to speak to us today on the ethics of human experimentation for national security purposes. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Moreno.
Thank you, and thanks to the university for having me. Thanks to Ellen for being such a good host. And, you know, Ellen, I didn't realize until I saw this that it's Adlai Stevenson College. My mother was madly for Adlai. So if you don't know what that means, I'll explain that to you later. This is a little bit of an offbeat talk for a philosopher, but all my work is pretty offbeat for a philosopher. I'm interested in the history of science, history of medicine, and the way that medical ethics has played into that, to sort of our political history and our cultural history. This topic came out of some work I did as a member of the staff of a presidential advisory committee under President Clinton in 94, 95. And this was an advisory committee that was both kind of a truth commission and an ethics commission. It was a truth commission in the sense that there are lots of rumors around the country about secret experiments sponsored by the federal government involving human beings on ionizing radiation. And it was an ethics commission in the sense that the President asked us not only to dig around in secret documents and declassify them, which is part of what my work was, but also how did the standards of human experiments in the 1940s through the 1970s compare to our standards for doing ethical human experiments in the mid-1990s when we were doing this work. So this was a very unusual experience, and when I finished that, I had a lot of stuff that I had not put together, and so I said, well, you know, if you're an academic, you don't want to leave any paper unpublished. So I then began to do research not only on the history of human experiments involving radiation, but also more generally about the history of national security-related human experiments. And that led to a book that Ellen mentioned called Undue Risk, which I published about 6 years ago. There's another book that I published last year called Mind Wars about neuroscience and national security. And I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow afternoon, I think. This is a talk that really does get into the history of medicine, and I actually like to do this historically, as you'll see, because you really need to give people a grounding, I think, in this stuff. And I will try not to talk for more than 45 minutes or so, but I usually lie about that, and then open up the discussion. I'm sure you all know who this is, as well-educated University of California students and faculty. So this is not somebody I would have known who this is either, except that before I got to Penn, I taught at the University of Virginia, and this man was the youngest graduate in the history of our medical school at the University of Virginia. He was 16 when he graduated from medical school. but he graduated in 1867 when there was a lot less medicine to learn. This picture shows him. His name was Walter Reed. He's the person for whom the Army Hospital is named in Washington. This shows him at the height of his career. As you can see, he was an Army doctor. And Walter Reed is famous mostly because he went to Cuba at the order of the Army Surgeon General in 1900 to figure out once and for all what the source of yellow fever is. And if you don't know anything about yellow fever, it's one of the scourges of humanity that is pretty much forgotten now. Yellow fever, diphtheria, these were diseases that killed many, many people. In the United States, there were repeated yellow fever epidemics. People didn't understand, it's a very horrible way to die. And people didn't understand how yellow fever spread. There were various theories at the time. And as you may remember, 1900 was just 2 years after we got Cuba and the Philippines in a nice little war with Spain. So there was a detachment of American soldiers holding Cuba. There was interest in building a canal, as you may remember, in the zone, which we finally did. So this really became a national security problem. What was the reason for this yellow fever outbreak in Cuba? And Reed was sent to figure it out. This is a picture of some of the soldiers who were in the detachment in Havana at the time. And so how do you think Walter Reed figured out what the source of yellow fever is? I mean, there were three theories at the time. It was a tick, it was a mosquito, and it was direct contact with people who had yellow fever. He basically did a controlled experiment. On the last arm of the experiment, the direct contact with people or the fluids of people who had yellow fever, he put some of these soldiers into that part of the experiment. One of the unfortunate people who was part of this was Corporal Wood, who was in the lower right hand. Let me try to wake you up by giving you the setup for this part of the experiment. They took the blood, vomit, and feces of people who had just died of yellow fever, poured it on a cot, I can't make this up, then poured it on blankets, put the soldiers on the cot, under the blankets, and left them there for 24 hours. Public health ain't pretty. Turned out they didn't get yellow fever. Neither did the people who were exposed to the bite of the tick, but people who were exposed to the silverback female mosquito did get yellow fever. We celebrate Walter Reed because this is a great public health discovery that saved countless future lives. They then went around to all the pools of standing water in Havana and environs, and that was the end of yellow fever. But we also celebrate Walter Reed because of the way he performed this experiment. This is a one-page, we would today call it a consent form. They would have, in those days, called it a contract. Remember, this is 1900. I'm going to show you the English language version of this document in a minute, but notice that it is signed by one of the local volunteers, shall we call them. Antonio Benigno is a Spanish worker. So they used soldiers and some of the local men who had emigrated from Spain to Cuba for work. And they recruited them when they got off the boat, some of them to be in this experiment. And this is what we today call a consent form. And I know you can't read it, most of you, from where you are, but basically what it says is, I know I'm going to be in an experiment. I know it has to do with yellow fever. I could die in the experiment, but I'm in Cuba, so I could die anyway. I will get excellent medical care. If I take the bite of the mosquito, I will get $100 in American gold. If I get sick, I'll get $100 in American gold. And if I die, the money will go to my family. Well, now modern philosophers and ethicists might not be too happy about the money part. $200 is a lot of money in those days. They might not be too happy with the promise of excellent medical care, because the reality is they didn't know what to do if you had yellow fever. But one has to say that I don't know if any of you have volunteered to be in a clinical trial, a human experiment. If you ever have been, you've signed a document that is written by a lot of lawyers and is pages and pages and pages. This is one page, and it's in pretty simple English and Spanish. So there are a lot of reasons that Walter Reed probably decided to be the first to use such a document. One was to protect himself, historians think, from charges of exploiting human beings in experiments the way that there had been other scandals in the 1890s in Europe and in the U.S. about doing human experiments. So he apparently tried to, as it were, inoculate himself from such charges by using this document. The fact that it happened in 1900 when it did also tells us something about the way that ethics has evolved. There was a general agreement, of course, for a long time before that you don't just use people, you just exploit people. But now people thought it should be articulated more. There's this notion now of a signed document, which was, as I say, unprecedented. So for various reasons, around 1900, things began to change. It was also the time when experimental medicine, experimental science, experimental biology began to make more sense. There was germ theory that was discovered in the 1870s, 1880s, developed in the 1880s. There were physiological laboratories that were doing experiments on frogs. So there was a lot of excitement about biology and science. So a lot of things converged, a lot of elements converged to make this the time when the first consent form would be used in a human experiment. That worked pretty well. Most Americans, in particular, thought science was pretty cool, and Walter Reed was a great culture hero. In the years after that, I should mention that Walter Reed died a few years later of an infection that was misdiagnosed by a colleague. People thought that he died of taking the bite from the mosquito, that he experimented on himself. He actually didn't. One of his colleagues did and did die, one of his physician colleagues in Havana. But Walter Reed never took the bite, but people thought he did. He became a culture hero. There was a Broadway play called Yellow Jack, dedicated to the Christian martyr Walter Reed. There was a movie, a Hollywood movie, based on the play. Generations of students read about the heroic Christian martyr for science, Walter Reed, who took the bite and so forth. He actually didn't, because after his colleague died, who was 32 years old, he wrote to his wife that at the ripe old age of 49, he was probably not a good candidate for such an experiment. But nonetheless, the urban myth propagated that he was a hero of science, that he had given himself, martyred himself for science, and so it became a big hero. That actually was a great thing for experimental medicine. For the next 40 years, Americans, there are occasional scandals about using children in experiments and polio vaccine experiments and so forth, but for the most part, Americans felt that medicine could be done ethically, and of course it could be a great thing for human beings, for society, because look what Walter Reed managed to do. Well, that began to change at the end of the Second World War, when it was discovered that hundreds and hundreds of people had been used in concentration camp experiments by the Nazis. And this is actually an image of the 23 defendants in Germany after the war in what is often called the doctor's trial. And this is a trial actually of 20 doctors and several medical bureaucrats for their role in horrific experiments in the Nazi concentration camps. There's a little trivia here, and not the last piece of trivia I will offer you in the next 45 minutes or so. There were 13 trials of Nazi war criminals after the war, and they're in Nuremberg. There are other trials in other places in Germany, post-war Germany. There were never more than 24 defendants in any of the Nuremberg trials. Why? This is not rocket science, that's right. There were 24 seats in the box, right. So the Allies got together and decided which of their prisoners were going to be tried. And they actually interviewed 350 German doctors for possible indictment. The medical profession in Germany was very enthusiastic about Nazism for various reasons I can talk about later if you like. So this is the doc, and this is the only really disturbing image I'm going to show you this afternoon. This is a very famous picture of an individual who's being frozen to death or nearly to death in a hypothermia experiment. So why would and by the way, it's very important. You can make out the insignia perhaps on this soldier's chest, on the left. Right? The fellow on the right and left side of his chest. What does that look like to you? Looks like wings, right? So these were Luftwaffe officers, officers in the German Air Force. Why would the Luftwaffe be interested, the German Air Force be interested in how to treat people who had frozen to death or nearly to death? Close. Close. They get shot down in the North Sea, Battle of Britain, and there were different theories about how to treat people who had hypothermia. So today, any of you have any EMT training? You go home and look at your Merck manual or your handy-dandy guide to how to take care of sick people for lay people. You'll see that the protocol, if a kid falls in through the ice, I don't have ice in California, but maybe up in the mountains somewhere. If the kid falls through the ice skating, what's the approach? They're supposed to be wrapped in blankets and gradually rewarmed, hopefully with the bodies of people next to them. So gradual warming was the protocol that was developed in the concentration camps in this experiment, and it now appears in basically all of your textbooks.
I apologize for interrupting. But is your cell phone on?
Oh, sorry. I've got a million pockets, so it's very hard to tell. Give you that. It's okay. So these experiments included hypothermia. They also included, also sponsored with Luftwaffe, actually high-altitude explosive decompression experiments. So what happens to a pilot if he has to get out of his aircraft? What's the altitude that's a safe altitude for the pilot? So for that, they brought in a low-pressure chamber from Berlin, brought it to Dachau concentration camp, and they put people in it and lowered the air pressure, the atmospheric pressure until their lungs exploded, basically, to see how far that would have to go. So these were some of the experiments, but what I'd like to point out, and what people aren't generally aware of, is that this was an experiment done for national security. Right? This was a military-sponsored series of experiments. There are others as well, as was the Walter Reed experiment that I told you before. So, they got the good side and the bad side of these experiments conducted by the military. This is actually my favorite of the so-called, the most fascinating to me of the 23 defendants in the Nazi doctors trial. This is Karl Brandt. Just to give an idea what kind of people we're talking about, these were not people who a psychiatrist would diagnose as mentally ill. There's a kind of I think there's a notion that, like Joseph Mengele, who did his twin experiments, that he was a psychopath. Well, Joseph Mengele was an MD, PhD. He was an up-and-coming young medical researcher. He escaped to Argentina. Karl Brandt was one of Hitler's personal physicians. He was a surgeon by training. He was in charge before the war of the T4 program, which was the program that so-called euthanized people who were mentally ill or profoundly retarded. That program developed a gas called Zyklon B that was then used in the killing concentration camps. Brandt, interestingly, when he was one of the 7 who was sentenced to die by hanging, and when Brandt was sentenced, he offered the courts an alternative to hanging him. What do you think that was, as a good experimenter? Not quite. He said, why don't you, instead of wasting my body, why don't you use me in a lethal medical experiment? Interesting rationalization of kind of his role and the role of science, giving his life to science and so forth. The court decided they'd just hang him. So that was the end of that. What's really interesting about this trial, though, is that out of the trial came a 10-point code of ethics that the judges wrote as the third part of their decision in the case. 3 American judges. Posterity knows this as the Nuremberg Code. This is the first sentence of the Nuremberg Code. Now, why would the judges be so concerned about writing their own code of ethics? Well, it turns out that if you start looking at the trial, the defense lawyers for the Nazi doctors were really good. The prosecution lawyers were young army lawyers who knew nothing about science and medicine. But the Nazi defendants were able to choose their own lawyers, and they had very senior defense counsel. They were very experienced. And their argument was this, and this really shook up the judges. What was a 6-week trial, they thought was going to be a 6-week trial, turned out to be a 6-month trial. They thought it was going to be open and shut, right? These doctors killed people, end of story. Well, the defense argued, look, there are in fact no good, they said in 1946 and during the war, there were no good international rules that govern human experiments. In fact, the Allies did human experiments on many of the same kinds of issues that these defendants did, and they used what kinds of people? They used prisoners. They entered into evidence this Life magazine story from June 1945, June 3rd, 1945. And I don't know, I love this picture. To me, it's really iconic because you could spend a lot of time, I think, analyzing this picture. So let's say that this is a malaria experiment that took place this happened to be at the Stateville, Illinois prison. Also took place in federal prison in Georgia and a federal prison in New Jersey. This is a White House-sponsored malaria experiment. 800 federal prisoners involved in this. Why would the White House be interested in malaria in 1946? Sorry, in 1945, spring of 45. What would we think we were going to have to do in the fall of 45?
Attack Japan.
Go into Japan, right? And the fear was that hundreds of thousands of soldiers would die invading the home islands of Japan. And they thought a couple of million Japanese civilians would die. So they wanted to be as prepared as they could. Now, it turns out that infectious disease often takes out more soldiers than bombs and bullets, including, in that part of the world, malaria. So, and there was no good therapy for malaria. They had quinine. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. So they identified 800 volunteer prisoners who would be exposed to malaria. And if you can see in this picture, that there's this glass jar, and basically what's going on is these malaria-carrying mosquitoes are biting this young man through the opening of the jar. You can see that, and the symbolism in the picture is terrific. The bars behind him show he's obviously in prison. How would you characterize this young man? Look, kind of cute? I don't know. I mean, my freshmen weren't so sure when I showed them this picture at Penn last year, but you know, he's kind of a nice-looking young man. What about this guy on the left? What would you call him? A total nerd, right? Total geek. It hasn't changed. The imagery of the science geek is still the same. But he's looking very intently at these mosquitoes. And so there's a lot going on in this picture, I think. The superintendent of the prison was so proud of what his men had volunteered to do for the war effort that he told the photographers not to take any pictures until the scientists could show up. So this is exactly what happened. And so this was, by the way, a magazine in 1945 was not like a magazine today when, you know, everybody's got their own magazine, right? In 1945, there were 7 or 6. Time, Life, Newsweek, Look, the Saturday Evening Post. Everybody read the same magazines. So this was unbelievable coverage for this experiment. And obviously it was not secret. Right? So let me just show you this is the second page of the photo spread. I told my graduate student, at first he was going to take the NEAT ad out of it, but I said, no, leave it in, because you know, it kind of makes the point that we should have invested in NEAT instead of Microsoft, because you know, body hair will always be with us, but I'm not sure about Microsoft. So now the question is, now how many of these guys died out of 800 exposed to malaria? 0. None of them died. And looking back on it, numbers of them said this was the greatest thing they did in their lives. Why? Their friends from high school were in the Pacific, right? Or their fathers in some cases, right? Their brothers. They were in prison because they did some stupid things. So this was a way for them to pay back, they said. Well, we didn't actually ever invade Japan because of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was the end of that war. But the judges were so astonished by the defense, the very effective defense of the Nazi doctors by their lawyers, that they decided to write an international code of ethics called the Nuremberg Code, which I'm going to come back to. Meanwhile, we enter the atomic age. This is what Hiroshima looked a few days after the blast. Some of you have seen, there was a really powerful documentary a few months ago on HBO about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Obviously, continuing debate about that. There was tremendous interest in radiation in those days. This is Joseph Hamilton on the left, famous Berkeley professor, who was one of the early experts on health physics, the effect of ionizing radiation on the body. He used to he's got a volunteer drinking some water that's ionized and a Geiger counter there. Hamilton liked to do this experiment in front of his class at Berkeley. He used to like to drink some of this stuff and then walk past the Geiger counter and make it pop. He died in his late 40s of cancer, so it's probably not a good experiment to do. The whole history of this, the role of radiation and government-sponsored radiation experiments, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about, really came up in the early 90s. This was as I mentioned, that presidential commission that I worked for. This is the cover of our final report. It's 1,000 pages. You're welcome to read it anytime you want. But let me just give you a taste of it, what was going on in those days. So this is how top secret information was passed around the United States in the 1940s during the war. This is a telegram. By the way, if you want to send a telegram now, you can't. The last telegram was sent about a year and a half ago, I think, 2 years ago. The telegram has to be decoded, but if you can read it, it's from Robert M. Fink, who was a doctor at the University of Rochester, and it's to Doctors Wright Langham and Lou Hempelman. So Langham and Hempelman were two experts on ionizing radiation and the body. And it's dated November 30th, 1945, 11/30/45. And it says, HP3 and HP4 injected Tuesday, November 27th, HP5 injected Friday, November 30th. HP stands for human product. Decoding this, in 1945, J. Robert Oppenheimer and the people who were running the Manhattan Project, the project to develop the atomic bomb, were very concerned about the effects of ionizing radiation on their young graduate students who were doing various projects as part of this top secret project to build the atom bomb. And they had really weird experience, anecdotal experience. They really couldn't tell how bad this stuff was for you. In particular, they were working with a metal called plutonium, which was isolated for the first time in 1940, 41, is tens of thousands, 20,000 times, as I recall, more radioactive than uranium. They get plutonium from uranium, and because they didn't have enough uranium in those days to make a lot of bombs, they wanted to see if they could make a bomb using plutonium. So they had these grad students working with this stuff, and there are a lot of weird stories during the war. For example, one of their grad students had a beaker full of plutonium in a liquid suspension, and he clumsily knocked it against a lab bench, lab table, and it vaporized and got into his face and eyes and mouth. And he realized, what had happened, and he ran down the hall, and he feared he would die. Maybe not because of plutonium, but because he had just destroyed much of the country's plutonium stash, and his professor was going to kill him. Right? He lived. But then there was other fellow in Chicago. There's a famous story about the atomic pile in Chicago, under the University of Chicago's squash court, top secret. He drops a screwdriver into the rods. The room starts to turn purple, which means that this thing is about to go critical, could blow up much of Chicago. He reaches into the rods to pull out the screwdriver. He dies a miserable death within 2 weeks. So they were wondering this was a worker safety problem. Now they knew from rats that plutonium in rats goes to bone, and they knew from rats how fast rats excrete plutonium. You don't want this stuff in your body for very long. It's what radiologists call an internal emitter. You don't want that. You especially don't want it in your lungs. But they didn't know how fast their graduate students would excrete plutonium. So what they decided to do was they identified 17 people around the country who were hospitalized with bone cancer. And they decided that they would secretly give them plutonium. Now, why bone cancer? I theorized that they thought they might have a magic bullet for bone cancer, because we know from rats that this stuff goes to bone. Unfortunately, of the 17 people who got the plutonium, about a third were misdiagnosed. They didn't have bone cancer. One of them had a stomach ulcer. These things will happen. And this is 3 of them who were given plutonium. This is about 3 of them who were given plutonium in 1945. So these were secret plutonium injections for the sake of worker safety. By the way, how many of the 17 people who got these injections, who were hospitalized, died of their plutonium injections, do you think? None. The ones who had cancer died of their cancer. The others survived. One guy survived into the early 1970s. He was curious about why the University of California, San Francisco hospital would call him back every few years to examine his excreta. His sister, who was a nurse, was very suspicious of this. He died without knowing that he'd been in a plutonium experiment. So these are 2 letters. I'm just going to show you the second one from the Atomic Energy Commission in 1947, as you can see, to physician contractors who were working with radioisotopes, radiation. The Atomic Energy Commission inherited all of the contracts and well, not most of the contracts and responsibilities of the Manhattan Project. Now, if you were a lawyer for the Atomic Energy Commission, the USAEC, after the war, and you find out about these secret plutonium injections, do you think that you would advise your client, the U.S. government, to go public with this? No, no. They decided, these plutonium injections are very embarrassing. It could look bad for the government to have injected its own people with plutonium without their permission. There are these trials going on, these Nazi doctor trials going on at the same time as we're looking at these records. We definitely don't want to be associated with that. So they decided not to release that information. We only learned about this in the early 90s, after the documents were declassified, partly through that commission I mentioned. But what's interesting about this document is that it says that if you're using our radioisotopes to do experiments, medical experiments, you have to get informed consent. That's the first time that term, informed consent, appears in writing, anywhere, so far as we know. It also, by the way, requires the informed consent of next of kin, which we would today say is actually unethical, because who's my next of kin to say whether I can be in an experiment or not? I'm a competent adult, it's up to me. So this was obviously not written, this was written by lawyers, not by doctors. Right? What happened to this document, which we discovered in the early 90s? It was forgotten as soon as the ink was dry. Let's give you a sense of what the radiation environment sort of was like in terms of the development of uranium and plutonium at the time. This is the Hanford Nuclear Facility in Hanford, Washington. This was where they got the plutonium from the uranium for the bomb. By the way, the first atomic bomb that was exploded in New Mexico was a uranium bomb. The Hiroshima bomb was, what do you think, uranium or plutonium? It was uranium. Why? They only had 3 of them. They weren't sure the plutonium bomb would work. So they didn't want to mess around and drop a bomb that would be a dud. So the first bomb, the bomb that hit Hiroshima and killed over 100,000 people and vaporized tens of thousands of them, was uranium. The second one was plutonium that fell on Nagasaki. Plutonium came from Hanford. This is the worst environmental site in the country, which is saying something. This was a very leaky facility in what was a pristine part of Washington State. This is where the rods came out as part of the atomic pile. These are workers at Hanford. You can see that every day they had to go in. These are 1950s sort of period pictures. You can see they had their radiation badges that they had to hand in every day to see if they'd been exposed. This is a guy being dusted for any radioactive dust. These are people who are testing the air. How'd you like to work in a place where every day they're testing the air to see how much radiation there is in the air? They're taking blood periodically. I like this one especially. When you go to the cafeteria, you don't want to see them dusting the tables for radioactive debris. I mean, that's not good for the appetite. And this is Wright Langham, one of those health physicists I mentioned before, with his colleague. Now, I showed you that first line from the Nuremberg Code. I'm now going to show you a document that has that line again. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This is a document that was top secret for a long time. Don't worry, you're not going to go to Guantanamo because I showed you this. It's no longer top secret. It's been declassified. This is a really amazing document. This is dated 26 February 1953. This is from the Secretary of Defense to the Secretaries of the Army, Navy, and Air Force. And what I want to point out to you is that it has that first line again. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It goes on to repeat the Nuremberg Code word for word. Now, if you handed something like this in to one of your professors here at Santa Cruz, your professor would have to report you to the provost. Because although the Secretary of Defense quotes the Nuremberg Code word for word, he leaves out a little fact, which is what? There's no cite, right? It's verbatim the Nuremberg Code. Now, in my book, Under Risk, I tell an unbelievably interesting story about how the Nuremberg Code got to be the policy of the Pentagon for doing human experiments involving atomic and biological and chemical weapons. This is 1953. This is about 7 or 8 years before the first academic scientists get interested in the issue of written consent for people who are in experiments in the United States. So the Pentagon is actually way ahead of the Academy. So this was top secret, and this was to govern all experiments for defensive purposes. They called it in those days ABC warfare research. Very convenient. Atomic, biological, and chemical. I would show this slide to people before 9/11 and before the anthrax attacks in fall 2001, and we'd say, yeah, it's kind of interesting history, but who cares? Well, we care a lot now, again, about biological and chemical weapons. So, a very interesting story about this document, signed by Charlie Wilson, who was called Engine Charlie. He was Eisenhower's Secretary of Defense. When he was being confirmed, he had just come from General Motors as the CEO of General Motors. And some congressmen were worried that, how could he, would the interests of General Motors conflict with the interests of the Pentagon? And he would say, what's good for General Motors is good for America. That was a famous statement by Engine Charlie. So he signed it. I will condense the story by telling you that the doctors and the admirals and the generals who got this document thought it was a catastrophe because it required written consent for medical experiments for soldiers and airmen and Marines. They thought it was a catastrophe because, first of all, if you're a doctor, they said, doctors, they have their own code of ethics, right? Hippocratic Oath, it's worked very well for 2,000 years. We don't need to be told by the Pentagon how to treat people we're taking care of. And the admirals and the generals were very annoyed because, as one officer once said to me, Dr. Moreno, it's a funny thing. Ever since I got into the Army, I've done something stupid every day, like walking around with live ammunition going by me, or standing out in the rain all night with a dummy rifle. Everything my mother told me not to do. So, the idea of consent in the military, it's not really familiar. So how well did this rule work? I'm going to call it the Wilson rule, the Wilson policy. Written consent for anybody in atomic, biological, and chemical weapons experiment if you're in the military. Well, not too well. Briefly, this is a memo this is what we politely call a cover your butt memo. This was written by an officer in the Air Force who was in charge of flash blindness experiments. Turns out that when you drop the atomic bomb, you're blinded. And so they really wanted to know, how blind do you get and for how long? So the long and the short of it is, behind this memo, this fellow has been doing some flash blindness experiments with American flyers, and they've been blinded, temporarily blinded. Now he hears that there's a policy that the Secretary of Defense has for doing ethical human experiments, and he's saying here, I wish you would tell me what the policy is, because I'm still doing these experiments, and I don't know what I don't know what the rules are. So they didn't do a really good job in getting these rules across to people. In fact, in 1975, following the revelations of LSD experiments in the Army, which I think some of you know about, You know, that the Army did, and the CIA did LSD experiments. Everybody knows that. It's really interesting. I'll talk more about that in my talk on Mind Wars tomorrow. This is what the Army Inspector General said. Going back to the Wilson rules, what happened? Well, I think this is a wonderful understatement. They didn't really interpret it consistently. So here's an example. By the way, you can go on YouTube. There's wonderful stuff that I show my students on YouTube that I commend to you about the atomic bomb detonations. You know, there were 250,000 soldiers between 53 and 62 who were deployed to be within miles of ground zero in atomic bomb tests. This is one of them. So this is, they're in the, you can see that they're getting ready now to witness the blast. They put their heads down, they do the countdown. There's the mushroom cloud, and there you get a sense of the sort of where they are. Some of these guys actually marched through ground zero a little later after the heat died down, and it was very common. Now, ask yourself this question: was this a human experiment? Well, a lot of the so-called atomic soldiers, as they call themselves, years later, the atomic veterans, they believe it was. This was not classified as a human experiment. This was not considered to be a human experiment. What was this considered to be in the 1950s? Exactly. It was a training exercise for the atomic battlefield of the future. So if you read some science fiction from the 1950s, you'll see my favorite, Starship Troopers, Heinlein. Not the really terrible movie that came out like 10 years ago or something, but I mean the original. They've got nuclear-tipped bazookas on their backs. The atomic battlefield of the future. This is about desensitization. This is not an experiment. So, since it wasn't an experiment, what rules do not apply? Secretary Wilson's memo, right? The consent rules don't apply. Not a human experiment. So, the bottom line here is, who decides what counts as what fits in what box in a bureaucracy is a very important question. So that's the story with the atomic soldiers. Only a few years ago we found out that there was this program with biological agents called shipboard hazard and defense. They would fly over ships and also, by the way, over soldiers on the ground and spray aerosolized biological agents. We did this to our own guys. One of the big figures in this was this fellow, Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb was like the real Q that you see in the 007 movies. Q gives all those cool things. I was a little upset he wasn't in the last movie, by the way. But anyway, in the earlier movies, he's given all this cool stuff in every story to Bond. Sidney Gottlieb was sort of like Q for the CIA. He was the guy who did the MK Ultra experiments involving LSD. This is a obviously declassified but highly redacted, highly edited memo. It's actually a budget memo. It says how much you can spend to pay people to do, and I'll show you this. This project will include, this is also 53, by the way, big year, 1953. This project will include a continuation of the study of biochemical, neurophysiological, sociological, and clinical psychiatric aspects of LSD, and also a study of LSD antagonists and drugs related to LSD. Why was the CIA interested in LSD? Sorry?
To find a truth serum.
Partly for truth serum, partly to see if you could somehow get into the water and disorient an enemy population, maybe enemy soldiers, right? Maybe to see also what it would do to our guys. So what if they kidnapped an American atomic physicist and gave him LSD? Would it make him or her talk? Right? So they were very concerned about that as well from a defensive standpoint. In fact, the scenario I just told you kind of happened. This is Frank Olson. Frank Olson was the CIA's anthrax expert who was stationed at Fort Detrick in Maryland. He was given LSD. Not clear exactly what was going on with that, but if you go on the web, you'll see there's a lot of stuff about Frank Olson. It's kind of become part of the culture now. He jumped out of the 11th story of the hotel that's across from Penn Station in New York. And you can read about Frank Olson. His son Eric Olson, a psychologist, has a lot of stuff on the web about it. When this was declassified in 1975 by President Ford, the CIA said, oh, well, he became psychotic. And, we gave him LSD. We shouldn't have done that. It was a terrible thing. And then he became psychotic. We took him to New York for treatment, but it was too late. He jumped out of the window. Well, very few people jump out of closed windows with the blinds drawn. Not a common thing. Eric Olson, his son, believes that this was actually a CIA assassination. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but this one I think is plausible because he believes that his father was about to blow the whistle on the MK-Ultra experiments. We'll never know exactly what happened there. Here's an obituary for Dr. Olson from 53. Here's another guy who died in 53. It was a big year somehow. This is Ronald Madison, Maddison, 2 Ds in Madison. You can also read about him on the web. He was in a sarin gas experiment at Porton Down in the United Kingdom. Sarin gas is by far, with tabun and 1 or 2 other gases that were accidentally, that were more or less accidentally created by R.G. Farben before the Second World War, a chemical company making dyes. Unbelievably, one drop of this stuff can kill lots of people. It's incredibly lethal stuff. He was in the service in the UK. He and a number of other guys volunteered for what they might have thought was a flu experiment. He was exposed to sarin and died within minutes of exposure. His death was covered up until a couple of years ago, and only when a local constable got irritated by all the rumors about this in Porton Down, he reopened the case, and a jury trial actually found that he died as a result of a medical experiment, which now has opened up a lot of the families of other guys who were in these experiments at the time for lawsuits in the British system. So if you read about this, you can see that there's stories about the Ronald Madison case, which we're only now starting to learn about. Back to Maryland, Fort Detrick, Maryland. If you go there today, you can see this. This is affectionately called the 8-ball. It's a 1 million-liter cloud chamber, and I want you to pay attention to the portholes on the sides. This is what it looked like with some of the dosimetry devices underneath it. This is a really cool model of the 8-ball. I'm going to tell you what this is in a minute, what they used it for. So this is what it looked like when it was actively being used. It was used to be surrounded by a wooden building, burned down a number of years ago. And these are scientists who are using dosimetry devices to figure out how many molecules and what the size of molecules are in the space in the 8-ball. Okay, so what's in the 8-ball? Well, these people have volunteered to inhale whatever's in the 8-ball. This is the 1950s, through the early 70s. What they're inhaling is stuff like Venezuelan equine encephalitis, Q fever, Rift Valley fever, tularemia. These are not things that you want to get. And they're volunteering. Well, anybody want to volunteer to be in this experiment? They're checking out these days, to that day, they're checking out gas masks. Well, it turns out that these were Seventh-day Adventists in the Mid-Atlantic area who were in the military. The Seventh-day Adventist Church made a deal with the Army that if their people would volunteer to be in these biological weapons experiments at Fort Detrick, they would not be assigned to active combat, which they would prefer them not to do. So this was not secret. This is actually a brochure that the SDA Church published, and I love these pictures. Rift Valley Fever Project volunteers take an outdoor break from hospital routines. And this is a guy in the exercycle. They're having a nice time in between inhaling poison. These are some more pictures from the brochure. Now, these guys have reunions. This is one that they held about 20 years ago. They call themselves Project Whitecoat. They gave me some T-shirts with Project Whitecoat on it. They have reunions. They're very proud of their service. They actually did important work at Fort Detrick in those days, and much of this information is very important to defending against biological weapons. So, and these are some medics that I interviewed a few years ago for Undue Risk, these people were probably getting their anthrax vaccine. Again, experimental volunteers, a very good group of people. And now we come to today. So I just want to give you a sense of where we are today with this to bring it really up to date. So normally, it is required to do human experiments before you can get a drug approved by the federal government. Not many of you may know that that is no longer an absolute requirement. If you can show that this is a drug that will be really important for society to protect itself against a biological weapon, maybe a foreign adversary, and if you can't ethically do that experiment on people. So let me give you an example. The anthrax vaccine has never been tested for airborne anthrax, of the kind that went into like Senator Daschle's office in the fall of 2001 in the envelope. Never been tested, never been approved for that. Anthrax is normally acquired by people who are working with animal skins. So they get it through the skin, right? So the vaccines we have are approved by the federal government for use with people who get it that way, not for people who get it through the respiratory tract. So, interesting problem. If you want to, can you order people in the military to take the anthrax vaccine against, say, Saddam Hussein's biological weapon, anthrax, if it's never been approved by the FDA for that purpose? So the answer is yes, as we did in the first Gulf War. If you can get the FDA to say, it's okay, you're the Army, you need to do these things, we won't require informed consent. And that was done. Many people believe that that anthrax vaccine is partly responsible for Gulf War illness. I'm not so sure that's true, but people believe that. Anyway, after 9/11, Congress very hurriedly passed this new rule that basically says that if you've got something that's really important, it's unethical to give it to people. You can't give not even college students. You know, you can't even expose lab rats or college students to anthrax. You just can't do that. Well, lab rats you can. College students, you can't do that. That's wrong. You have to have the philosophy professor tell you that. That's a wrong thing. So you can't do this to people. So how do we get the information we need to approve it? Under this rule, if you expose 2 animal species to it, and you get the result you want, namely they don't get anthrax, then it can be approved for human use. That's very interesting. So this only applies to drugs that are really important for the society, perhaps to protect yourself against a chemical or biological attack. Now, I don't know how many of you are going to run out and buy, anthrax vaccine. I know how paranoid you are. There's also new creams. You might want to know, new ointments in the event of a mustard gas attack. They tested those on pigs because pig skin is the most like ours. Those have been approved. But I'm not worried about walking around, maybe I should, Philadelphia, for example, and being exposed to mustard gas. So I'm not going to go out and buy that stuff. So who's going to develop this? Well, the federal government has put about $6 billion into what they call Project BioShield to try to get university scientists and private companies to make stuff that could protect us against biological and chemical weapons. It's not going too well. The BioShield money is kind of languishing, partly because the companies don't want to do the work because they're afraid of liability if the stuff doesn't work. Right? So if I've got my handy-dandy, anti-mustard gas cream, and somebody runs over to me in Center City, Philadelphia, and pours some mustard gas on me, and I put the cream on really fast and it doesn't work, I could turn around and sue the company. So they're not too happy about that. They don't want to get into this area. There's no market for it except Uncle Sam. We're still worried about this, though. We don't really have a good vaccine or intervention for smallpox. There are all kinds of new things that I'm going to talk about tomorrow that have to do with neuroscience and national security that are kind of fresh off the block. This is the book I wrote about that. I kind of like the cover. So we are in kind of a new era now. We've still got to worry about dirty bombs, radiation warfare, all the stuff that they were getting ready for in the 50s, biological weapons, chemical weapons, trying to figure out how to prepare ourselves for that. Now, as I'm going to tell you tomorrow, big advertisement here for that talk, there's a whole new area of, I don't know how many of you work in neuroscience, have taken a neuroscience course, cognitive neuroscience. There's all kinds of new stuff coming out that the brain researchers are developing that people are now concerned could be used in warfare. So I guess the lesson is, although I believe in progress, we're getting better and better at creating newer and more clever ways to hurt each other. And the end of the book, end of Mind Wars, I say, it would be good if we could, all we're learning about the human brain, we could come out, turn this around so we would figure out how to avoid doing those things to each other. But we do live in a dangerous world. I think we are going to continue to do this kind of work to see how scientific discoveries to benefit people could also be used to hurt people, and how we have to protect ourselves against those who would mean us harm. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for your attention, and take discussion. Comments, questions, outrage? Especially outrage. Outrage is always fun. Don't be shy. Sir.
I was just, you mentioned the physician contractors with the Atomic Energy Commission, and that's sort of, little interstices between the state and the economy.
Yeah.
And with the Cuba thing, I know Roosevelt set up Camp Wyckoff when he got back. Again, Rough Riders, not really in the military, more like mercenaries. Tremendous amount of them died there, not many in Cuba.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how the contemporary military contractors play into this in terms of what the requirements are on them, what they might do with either their own people or with paying other populations.
Well, in terms of human experiments, today, first of all, with regard to soldiers, it's very difficult to use soldiers in human experiments now. There are all kinds of protections and rules, and there's all kinds of accountability. That's a population that we basically decided it's a group we don't want to make human guinea pigs. The history of that is pretty interesting, though, because your intuition could go the other way too, right? Since soldiers are people they're basically, what are they there for? They're there to take risks. So why not put them in risky human experiments that could benefit their brother and sister soldiers? And there's actually, in Undue Risk, I talk about how there's been a long-standing debate in the military about whether you could use soldiers. It would be wrong. We've generally decided today it's basically not kosher to do that, unless it's a situation like the Gulf, in the first Gulf War, where we thought Saddam Hussein had stores of biological weapons. We didn't know if the anthrax vaccine would work for aerosolized anthrax, but the first rule in the military is you have to accept any order that is both legal and might keep you fit for duty, right? So is that an experiment, right? If you're taking an anthrax vaccine that hasn't been approved for aerosolized anthrax, is that an experiment? Well, technically not. So soldiers, very hard. Prisoners also, very difficult to do under federal rules. Very difficult to do research involving prisoners. In fact, in my view, too difficult, because there are some psychological questions and sociological questions about prison life that we really need to know about. I was on a committee last year, this is separate from, on prison research, and we spent a day in San Quentin. It was talking to prisoners. There is prison research going on, not much, and they actually, for various reasons, generations of prisoners actually like being in research because it's a break in the boredom of prison life, among other things. So in terms of what's going on with human experiments right now, pretty tough to do. We were told in the 90s that there were no secret human experiments being done by the federal government. And I actually, although you can call me like the cab driver I had out to Dulles Airport yesterday, thought I was crazy to be so gullible. I actually believe that's true. However, as I told you, you don't have to call them human experiments sometimes to get the information that you want. You call them field tests, right? So, this is very slippery stuff. So federal contractors, I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow in the context of neuroscience. Most of what the federal government does is contracted out to university scientists. Now, some universities will not take secret contracts that involve classified work. Harvard won't, Stanford won't, Penn won't, but a number will. Penn State will, for example. So that becomes a competition among the universities who would really like some of that money. So this is it's in some respects a very settled area, and in some respects an area that is very unsettled. We can talk more about this. Yeah, Jake, you got to wait for the microphone.
So it seems to be kind of a common theme that we can make some exceptions to our, sort of settled bioethical assumptions when it comes to national defense, right? We can bend the rules a little bit. We can do things a little differently.
Finish your question, then I'm going to answer that part of it.
If we call it national defense, but of course, what counts as national defense is controversial in itself. And I'm wondering if you think ethicists have anything to say about that. I mean, I would argue the first Gulf War wasn't about national defense whatsoever. So should they have gotten an exception to that, to the tradition of
Well, okay. So good. Can I take that as a two-parter? Sure. So one of the questions we asked when we worked on that Clinton commission was, could we find a document from, say, President Franklin Roosevelt that said that because of the war, the national emergency, we could suspend the ordinary rules of sort of social ethics, and do experiments like the plutonium injections or something. So far as I know, there's never been an executive order from the President of the United States that said, ethics be damned. Right? It's not that straightforward. Could the rules be bent? Were they bent? Well, probably by 1945, even by the conventions of the day, it was wrong to give those people those plutonium injections. Even though nothing as it seemed happened to them because of that. It was wrong. They were being used as mere means, right? We can talk about Kant. People were quite well aware of that moral standard. So it was wrong at the time. It's clearly wrong today. We recommended that there should be compensation for any survivors. There are no survivors anymore. So part of the answer is officially the rules are never suspended. Unofficially, there are ways of managing and massaging the rules. Now, what counts as national defense, I'm not in a position to say. It's pretty much what the government decides counts as national defense. I mean, our public health arrangements also count as national defense. You can construe that very broadly, right, or national security. This is the puzzle here. Right? One of the puzzles here. What if you decide that, and we've kind of had this in the interrogation debate, what if you decide that you have to do something that is contrary to the rules, but it's absolutely crucial for the national interest. So you're going to do that in a classified domain, right? It happens, and this I think is really interesting, the federal rules require that even classified human experiments, secret experiments, be approved by an ethics committee. Right? So the CIA has a research ethics board. That's pretty cool. And by the way, the rules also say that if you're in that secret experiment that the CIA is doing, if there were such a thing, that you would have to give informed consent. So what does that mean? It means that you have to have the appropriate security clearance as a human subject to get the information you need to give your informed consent. And it means if you're on the research ethics board, that you also have to have the secret clearances you need to get the information to judge whether that's acceptable. But here's the rub. And this is why I think secret experiments could never be ethical. What if you dissent? You're the newly minted young philosopher ethicist from Santa Cruz. They put you on one of these secret committees. Somehow you get a security clearance. God knows how. And you I don't know if my professors, I'm thinking about Professor Sukiel back in Santa Cruz. I don't know if she would approve of this. I think this is an ethical experiment. You're the only one who objects. It's classified. What do you do? Right? If you go to the newspapers, you're sunk. Right? You're going to Guantanamo. Okay? So this is a real problem, and this is one that we wrestled with at the end of the advisory committee. Is it possible to do, if we could agree on what counts as national security, national defense, if we could agree that the existential, survival of the country partly depended on this, could we do an ethical secret experiment? It's very similar to the waterboarding, the torture issue. Right? Very similar. It's largely unresolved. But I think as long as there's no transparency, it's hard to argue that you could do that ethically, because the minority, the dissenters, couldn't get their day in court.
Jonathan, I'm curious. I mean, right there's sort of gut level reaction against the idea of people being experimented on without their consent. But we also know from cases on eBay and so forth that people will go out and sell their body parts and whatever, given the appropriate motive, even if they know that giving up the body part might in fact be fatal to them, like the people getting $200 in gold that you
Right.
you mentioned. So what about sort of a million flip side to the case we just sort of say, we have these experiments here, the endings may be awful, but we're going to pay you some seven-figure sum if you sign on the dotted line
Yeah.
and open the doors. Has that been sort of discussed or explored?
It has, yeah. It's one of the big continuing issues, and if you've said on institutional research review boards, IRBs, that do review protocols for human clinical trials, one of the continuing debates is how much money is too much to give somebody. So, for example, all the students in this room could be in a research study for a drug company tomorrow. You could make thousands of dollars if you're willing to be in residence in a drug company clinic for days on, say, a flu study. A lot of my medical students have done flu studies. You can get thousands of dollars for doing that. So research boards are always debating what's too much. And they use the word coercion. As philosophers, we know they shouldn't use the word coercion because that suggests physical, right? Some kind of physical force. But when is an incentive too much? So, although we do rest a lot on informed consent and the notion of self-determination in our contemporary medical ethics, we don't rest on it entirely. We still think that it's possible to offer somebody too much, that it could be exploitation. So if you're a poor medical student, a few $1,000s, man, that's a lot of money. For many people, at least. For the Penn medical students, it's not a lot of money, probably. But for many people, it's a lot of money who are students. So they wrestle with that all the time. And it's a very hard question. So, for example, what if you want to do research on, and this is a real case, what if you want to do research on somebody who's a cocaine addict? And, you've got them kind of dried out, but you want to see if your new medication might work. And this is a real story. Well, you want to pay them for their time. It's only fair. Well, you give cash to somebody who's a drug addict, and you're just asking for them to go out on the street again, right? So how can you do that, right? There's a big debate about pediatric research. It used to be that parents would get cash for bringing their kids in to be in a pediatric research study. Their parents didn't necessarily spend it on their kids. So today, the idea is you give them many places will give them a gift certificate to Toys R Us instead. So we know it's something that's likely to get to the kids. Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll get to a video game for the parents. But, this is something that people do worry about all the time. And it is very difficult. And it depends partly on the population you're using in your research, because if you're using people who are poor, little money is a lot more important to them. So it's a continuing problem. Prisoners, by the way, are not allowed to get any money. And soldiers don't get any money either for being in research.
I remember, I believe recently, that the FDA was called to task because it was not adequately supervising human research. And this was particularly in cases where the drug companies were responsible for the research. I would want my incentive to be that the FDA was adequately and more than adequately supervising.
Yeah.
And there are many, many areas in which
Right.
these systems
It's
fall out.
very complicated. Look, the ritual in Washington is if something bad happens that a federal agency is responsible for, you in an area they're theoretically responsible for, you call the head of the agency up to put him at a table, and all the members of Congress, who are on that committee, the senators or members of the House, tear him apart, right? They shake their finger. How could you? The American people expect more from you. What are we paying you guys for? And so on and so forth. And of course, whoever it is, the head of the FDA, whatever agency it happens to be, has to sit there and nod sweetly. Right? The reality is the FDA's budget has been frozen. They can't hire any new people. I don't know how many of you have been FDA headquarters in Rockville, Maryland. It's a dump. I mean, it's unbelievable, the conditions these people work in. And so, yes, there's definitely been, industries at fault. The FDA is often not doing what it should be doing, but it's partly because they're drastically understaffed. The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for anywhere, I've heard, from 30 to 60% of the American economy. They regulate everything we eat, and everything else we put on our bodies in terms of pharmaceuticals and devices. And they're drastically understaffed. So, members of Congress will beat them up because it's convenient, but the reality is they don't have the resources they need to do their jobs. This is one of the reasons that they've started this program. You probably know about it. That the drug company now, when it submits a drug, for potential licensing or device, they actually pay the FDA a subvention to go through the process of approving it. Some people say it looks like blackmail. It looks like you're bribing the FDA, right? Well, it's because the FDA doesn't have any money. They don't have enough money to do it without the drug or device manufacturer giving them some money so they can go through the approval process. It's pathetic. So, absolutely, FDA often makes mistakes. I'm no defender of the pharma, the drugs manufacturers, the device manufacturers, but I would have to say it's also our fault. Because as taxpayers, we don't write to our congressmen and women and say, why don't you fund the agency that is protecting our bodies adequately? We can talk more about this.
So, Jonathan, how do you feel about the fact that the FDA is now not testing everything?
Well, they're requiring, so on this end, the last bit you're referring to, they're requiring tests on two species in all cases in which it would be unethical to do in human beings. So again, you can't expose people to smallpox to test a smallpox drug. And the other condition is it's something that is of tremendous importance to the country, right? So you can't just, come up with a new version of Viagra and decide, we'll just test it on animals. We don't need to test this on people, and they won't approve that. So you have to have a very strong justification for not using human subjects. So, but nonetheless, there's this very interesting loophole now for national security purposes, but the drug companies aren't using it because there's no money in it. And they're worried about liability. Because, again, there's no money in it because I'm not going to buy the mustard gas ointment. I don't know about you. And they're worried about getting sued in case the stuff doesn't work. So there's, the pharmaceutical companies may be very patriotic, but they're not going to go into business anywhere where they're not going to make a buck, and they stand to lose a lot. Okay, well, I enjoyed it, and I hope to talk to you under less formal circumstances. So thanks for coming.